Come on, honey. Come to daddy.
Who's your daddy now?
That was from 2005's spy movie, Mr. and Mrs. Smith. In Hollywood, spying is a heart-pounding, high-stakes game, complete with gadgets and gunfire. But in real life, spies may look more like this. Walter Kendall Myers and Gwendolyn Myers, former State Department employee, and his wife, both in their 70s, charged with spying for Cuba for nearly 30 years. They weren't using those high-tech gadgets, but they may have caused still a very serious national security breach. And leading us to our question tonight, are real spies hiding in plain sight? We have a lot of interesting stuff to tell you about. Joining us from Washington with this, Peter Earnest, Executive Director of the International Spy Museum. In Boston, Daily Beast contributor and author Joseph Fender is with us. And his latest thriller, Vanished, we should mention, comes out in August. Also, CNN senior analyst Jeff Toobin back with me right here in New York. Peter, let me start with you on this. You spent 25 years running covert operations at the CIA. And when you look at this look at the details of this case, it was really sort of low-tech spycraft, I guess. Explain to us how they were operating.
Well, first of all, the fact it was low-tech doesn't mean anything if it worked for 30 years. That's the mark of success. And we've seen this case, as we've seen in other Cuban cases, where they received their instructions often by shortwave radio. That's right out of World War II. And the other thing is, Gwen, the wife, often provided information to the Cuban intelligence officers in a grocery store using her shopping cart. She would move along with her cart, the Cuban handler would come up alongside her, and at some point he would move off with hers and she would move off with his. Beautiful, simple, and it worked for 30 years.
Let me ask you, Joseph, I guess what the concern here is is sort of less that they were spying for Cuba, but the fact that Cuba traffics in intelligence. So where could that information have ended up, whatever it is that they were able to get?
Right. The Cubans like to make deals. The Chinese, for example, are very interested in electronic surveillance on us. The Cubans have a radar base outside of Havana, and Fidel Castro is known to have approached the Chinese to make a deal. So the Cubans actually they like to sell information to the highest bidder. I think that's one of the big concerns here. Not the only one, but one of them.
What do you think, Jeff? I mean, we look at this in terms of the threat, I guess, how many people are out there, how many we don't know, or do we know? Do we have an assessment of the extent to which all of this is going on?
I don't know what the current number is, but what's so striking about this story is that it's a real throwback to the Cold War era in the sense that these were ideological spies. They were doing this not for money because they were committed for whatever bizarre reason to Castro's Cuba. You had that kind of commitment in the Rosenberg case, in the famous spies in the Cambridge cell in England, Burgess and McLean. It seems now you have much more spies motivated by money, Aldrich Ames, people who are involved in the commercial flow of ideas and information, as opposed to ideology, which seems much less of a motivation in recent years.
And Peter and Joseph, go ahead.
I was going to say,
yes.
There are cases which we've uncovered very recently of people who still have an ideological attachment, whether it be to North Korea, to China, to Iran, maybe a patriotic attachment, and that can be combined with financial incentives. So I think that what Jeff is saying is right. The old-fashioned Rosenberg-type spy stuff, it's old hat. But the espionage, in fact, my sources tell me that espionage in the U.S. by Russia is probably at Cold War levels, surprisingly enough. We just don't know anything about it. We don't hear much about it.
They're not looking for missile silo information anymore. They're looking for how to run their businesses and technology. Isn't that generally right?
Well, I think
partly right. I'm sorry, Peter, go ahead.
Go ahead, Peter.
No, I would also throw in here, let's not overlook Al-Qaeda and its allies. And they are recruiting people who are highly ideologically motivated with a religious twist to it. And that makes them fanatics.
Right.
And is that where the danger truly lies? I mean, it's not the Cold War anymore. It's not necessarily the Russian spies or the Cuban spies. I mean, who is the greatest threat to this country?
Well,
I think the three countries that are spying the most
are
China, Russia, and Cuba. I'm sorry, Peter.
No. No, I was simply going to say we're at war right now with a non-state, and that's Al-Qaeda. But various people have come up in support of Al-Qaeda or affiliated with Al-Qaeda. And what you're dealing with are people who are motivated by either they've been drawn to the organization because without it they're nothing, or out of this religious fundamentalism.
Joseph, go ahead.
Campbell, I wanted to make a point, if I could, a very important point, which I think is often overlooked about the Kendall Myers case. The Cuban handlers wanted Kendall Myers to work for the CIA. He said, no, I'm not a good enough liar. He was afraid of the polygraph. What we've learned in this case is that if you work at the highest levels in the State Department, INR, he had a top security, top secret SCI clearance. He was never once polygraphed. So I think that's a concern. He had information of the same intelligence that we have at NSA, CIA, and DIA, but without the security procedures. That's a real concern.
Yes, and as you know, Joe, the State Department has held off on that for years. And after the Ames case, you had it introduced into the FBI. They now polygraph more regularly.
All right, gentlemen, we got to end it there. Well, go ahead quickly. Make your point, Joseph.
I was going to say George Shultz refused to take a polygraph when Ronald Reagan he said, I'm up to my keister in leaks. Shultz refused, and ever since then, the State Department has been resistant to adopting the polygraph, even at the highest levels of security. That's the concern here, I think.
It'll be interesting to see if that changes. Fascinating discussion. Many thanks to all of you. Peter Earnest, Joseph Fender, and of course, Jeffrey Toobin here with me in New York. Thanks very much. Appreciate it.
Thanks.